Good morning, everyone. Congresswoman Gonzalez, I first wanted to say, I think I speak for everyone in the room when I say our hearts go out to the people of Puerto Rico as they continue to try to recover from Hurricane Maria. And we actually have some video or stills of some of the images from all around the island of what people were experiencing these days to October, mid-October. So how is the recovery going? How is it going with restoring power, with restoring water, other basics?
I think the restoration of the power grid is the most challenging one. When you got still more than just 67% of the island is in generation. But generation is one thing, and people having power in their houses is another one. So that means when you don't have the whole grid being connected, our system is very fragile. So sometimes it goes back to 50, it goes back to 49. So that's the challenge we're still facing many times during the last months. And that means that it put a lot of strains in our business, in our economy. When you don't have business open, you need power to pump the water in our water system. So most of the water stations are using generators. Generators can be used for long periods of time, so you get maintenance to them. Right now, we got 90% of our water system is
You said 90?
90 is running because of the generators.
Mm-hmm.
So
But is it drinkable? Do people still have to boil it?
yes, in a 90% of the cases, but
Still boiling it? Okay.
yeah, yes, but it's because of the generator. So we need to get the power to all those areas so we can rely on, not just diesel or generators to get water. And same thing's happening with a lot of roads and bridges that were just cut away, landslides and mudslides in many areas. A lot of people lose their homes. We're still having the Blue Tarp program being installed in the island. So we are heading to Christmas, and a lot of people are staying with their relatives, with friends in many of the towns because they don't have, a roof on their house. Many of them has moved to the States. We're talking about more than 200,000 Puerto Ricans. So 2,000 Puerto Ricans are leaving the island a day. And those numbers are being provided from the governor of Florida. He got the numbers because he established in every airport in Florida a center to receive the Puerto Ricans coming from the island and provide for a transition for them. So we got those numbers. We don't got the numbers from New Jersey, Texas, Massachusetts, and the rest of the states. So
they're really going all over the U.S. Chris, I'd like to ask you, what have you seen on the ground regarding the federal government's efforts to really help move Puerto Rico forward? I know the White House has kind of given themselves 2 thumbs up, A+. What do you see on the ground?
So we've been down 3 times, at least I've been down with you. I was down there 4 or 5 days after landfall, and then most recently, a couple weeks ago, led a congressional delegation with the Congresswoman and a number of other senators and representatives. And I've seen a significant amount of progress. And you have to keep in mind that this was a historic hurricane season with a series of 3 historic storms between Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And we think about immediately after landfall in Puerto Rico, 100% of the island was without power, completely and totally without power. Where we are now, we are at 60% of generation. That's not actually customers with power, that's generation. So there's still a long way to go, but it was a historic response for FEMA in terms of the largest air bridge mission, largest blue roof mission, largest commodity distribution mission, largest food distribution mission. We still have about 3,000 FEMA employees on the ground in Puerto Rico, and then about 4,000, I believe, Department of Defense. At one time, the high was about 17,000 federal employees on the island. So we're making progress, but we have to keep in mind that it's getting the power back up, getting the water flowing on a reliable basis is going to take a long time. It
doesn't happen overnight.
Right, and as the Congresswoman mentioned, it was a fragile infrastructure. The power grid was frankly over time it evolved into a bit of an unstable situation with generation on the south side of the island and most of the load or the demand on the north side. And so you have to cross the spine of the island, the mountains, and that is just an exposed situation. And you want to get, generally speaking, from a grid perspective, you want to get generation as close to consumption as possible. So when we think about what the island looks like going forward, A, we need to get off, to the extent possible, fossil fuels, number 6 diesel, into something that's a little bit more efficient, whether it's liquid natural gas or also some renewables with wind and solar. But at the same time, we need to think about resilience. Last hurricane, or the helicopter flight we did 2 weeks ago, we went on the south side of the island, and the wind farms, the blades on the turbines snapped off. The solar fields.
Those are huge. Those turbines, that's hard to even imagine.
Yes, they are large, and that's a pretty big flying projectile as well. But the solar fields, it looked like a giant had just kicked them out of the way. So we need to think about resilience and how do you get back up and running. So that's part of what we're doing, working with PREPA and the Oversight Board and a number of the players down there. But how do you balance the demand side, particularly for the grid, with the generation? So some key factors when we rebuild.
Congresswoman, how concerned were you initially with some of the harsh tweets you were hearing from President Trump, and then just criticism from the mainland U.S. in general, that, well, your infrastructure was substandard before the hurricane hit, and the president was tweeting things like, we can't keep FEMA, the military, and first responders there forever. Did you then, and do you still have any concerns about the federal government's commitment to help Puerto Rico recover? There
are many issues here. First of all, we are a territory of the U.S., so that puts us in a different position from the rest of the states because we are never receiving the same amount of money to even build. So every time we got a health care, we need to have to borrow money to have the matching funds to actually get Medicare. If we're going to build a highway, we're going to build a road, we need to match funds for that. Actually, in the recovery process, we need to match to 20%. If you got an island that doesn't receive the same amount of money, it's going to continue the borrowing process. Right now, we got in a fiscal situation, so we don't have the money to borrow. So many of the programs, maintenance of all those infrastructure for many years, we got to decide, are we going to maintain the current infrastructure, or are we going to maintain the current budget situation in the island? So those sort of things are the one that a territory is not just Puerto Rico. We're talking about the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, and the rest of the territories. When we saw those tweets, of course, we were in a situation that we were looking for help. It was the first time in our history that we got in the island before the hurricane, FEMA, HHS, all the rest of the federal agencies.
So you're saying you were as ready as you could be?
I mean, there was no
considering the magnitude of the disaster.
Yes, and actually, never before. I think that we learned from Katrina, some sort. Now the states need to learn from Maria and what happened in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. And we need to rebuild our emergency and recovery process. It's so different when you're going to make that process in Florida and Texas that you can actually go from one state to another one. Just crossing lines.
Yeah, well,
going to an island is so different.
My community was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina, my community on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and immediately after me, so I was there covering it when the hurricane roared in for CNN, and there were these motorcades that were just came pouring in from everywhere, citizens and from the state of Florida to help us, but yeah. When you're an island, it's very different.
It's totally different. We still got a lot of personnel in the island. I mean, let me tell you something. We are in the Christmas season. That means that it's not just about the lights. It's just not about the Christmas tree. It's that you don't have a home. You can't go around because not all shops are open. You're moving to your relatives in the States. It's something that goes directly to your heart. It changed the mood of the people. It changed the way you think. In Puerto Rico is before Maria and after Maria. We are not seeing the same Puerto Rico as we used to have it anymore. So this is a changing process for the island. I mean, think of this here in DC. Can you stand 76 days without power? Of course not. So in Puerto Rico, it's the same thing. People are not used to have more than 60, 80 days without power. People with conditions, with sickness, can't stand living in a generator if they got the resources to have a generator. Not all people do that. So we're still struggling with a lot of issues. We have received the resources from the federal government, and we are grateful for that. We still need to connect to the power grid. Once we got that connection to the power grid, we can continue to recover in so many other areas. We can get business back. I mean, our pharmaceutical industry is 40% of our economy, manufacturing. They're not, doing what they used to be because there's no power. They're using generators. How many of those companies we're going to lose just because of that? The whole economy of the island, tourism, 48 bridges were washed away because of the hurricane, landslide, mudslides, communities that were cut off just because of this situation. It's devastating.
Well, Chris, it almost sounds like Mission Impossible, as you go through this list.
I think this is the only emergency when you have all communications down, no telecom, no radars, no water, no power. Complete shutdown. That was happening in Puerto Rico for a week.
But was it fair, do you think, and is it ever really to criticize a community after a disaster along the magnitude of Hurricane Maria? Category 5, winds of over 170 miles per hour, and how has that in any way inhibited U.S. efforts on the ground when residents might feel hurt or angry or mistrustful?
So statutorily, the way it works, the federal government is there in support of the state or territorial government, and that is just the operating assumptions you come in. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I think you've seen, if anything, this hurricane season kind of stressed that understanding of how the Stafford Act works, how the national response framework and the emergency support functions, how we work in support of the state and local government. So there's going to be a significant after-action process and some significant lessons learned. But what we see, and this was a mantra that really started cultivating under Administrator Fugate, but this whole of community response. So when you think about some of the comment about that FEMA won't be able to be there forever, we're already seeing that drawdown in forces from 17,000 high to about 7,000 or so now.
The need's no longer there?
It's not the need, it's that that certain aspects of the response and the recovery we've shifted from response into recovery. Response is always more manpower intensive than recovery. We've shifted to recovery. We've stabilized certain aspects of the recovery effort, instituted some additional rigor and support to the governor and his team, and so now we can start rolling in the additional assets behind it. Again, think about this whole of community response. Think about some of the stories you heard from the Red Cross, some of the celebrity chefs that were down there. Look, it was a all of nation, all of community, people helping people. Think to Harvey, think about the Cajun Navy that came in from Louisiana to help the folks in Texas. That's how emergency response needs to be, and that's how it's going to be going forward. There is, I think, nationally, and Administrator Long has mentioned this several times, and I've bought in, but as a nation, we need to improve our kind of culture of preparedness. We need to be a little bit more prepared to withstand disasters because the hurricanes are going to keep coming, the wildfires are going to keep coming. We need to make sure that as a country we can help our neighbors because the government's not going to always be able to get there. And I think the mantra is 72 hours,
right.
So 3 days.
Well, you mentioned the Stafford Act, and I wanted to get to that because, Congressman, you've proposed a change in a very important aspect so that Puerto Rico can rebuild a more modern infrastructure instead of simply replacing what was there, FEMA's requirement of replacing with like, kind, and quality, which has really kind of gone awry over the years. I remember right after Katrina interviewing the mayor of Grand Isle, Louisiana, and he said, FEMA wants us to replace our gas lines that were built in 1959 but go to find that same company and replace them with the same type of gas lines. This is crazy.
It's kind of the same thing in Puerto Rico when you have a power grid from the 50s and 60s, asking for have the same thing being rebuilt or just patch up. So, and I thank FEMA and the administrator for that. The money that has been poured in to the recovery of the power grid has been enormous. I mean, we're talking about more than $1 billion in the last month. And I know it's more than that through the Corps of Engineers, FEMA, and all the federal organizations that are actually, boots on the ground, making things happen. But right now, we need to make some changes to the Stafford Act to allow the government of Puerto Rico and allow the federal government to rebuild.
How is that going? I mean, have you?
Yeah, there are two bills. That
is it moving through Congress?
There are two bills that have been presented. One that I did in a bipartisan way. Actually, the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House I just got them in the island during this weekend, looking into that. The TNA was in the island a few weeks ago, looking at disaster program in terms of how we're going to recover from this kind of disasters in a nationwide scope. So one thing is just rebuilding in the way it was before, and another one is if you don't need that road anymore and you need another one, let's have that opportunity to make that change. And that's
in FEMA they call that an alternative project.
And that's
what you have to ask
Yeah,
for.
and that's the reason Puerto Rico just applied to Section 428 that allows that to happen. You got the pros and cons of that, but actually it's the first time FEMA is going to be approving all those projects in the island.
Chris, I mean, when you hear about this, and I know you're very familiar with the Stafford Act, but are you concerned that in the past that some of those kinds of restrictions actually inhibited communities that were struck by disaster from rebuilding better and more resiliently?
I think that's absolutely a factor. It's a reality. You've seen it in all over the Gulf Coast, the East Coast, up through Sandy. But I think your point is there are other programs available for hazard mitigation to improve the resilience of communities. So we need to be looking at the full scope and the full spectrum of options available. But to the point on 428, and I already mentioned this, but you go down to Puerto Rico and you look for the grid in particular, but you look at the way the grid is set up, it doesn't make sense. With the generation on the south side, the reason the generation's on the south side is because there used to be refineries on the south side. They don't refine there anymore, they just bring refined product in. So we need to take a fresh look at the way the system is architected or engineered and make sure it meets the demands of not just 2017, but 2025, 2030.
This is a great moment to have public-private partnerships going into the island. I mean, the government can't do it alone. And locally, we got laws to provide that and make partnerships to make that kind of investment.
Sorry to interrupt, but resilience also is expensive, but it's also expensive not to be resilient. A great example of something that's expensive but worth it is burying transmission and distribution lines in communities. The one around San Juan, transmission lines were buried, they stayed up. Elsewhere on the island, particularly across the spine of the island, they went down. Burying lines across the spine of the mountain is going to be prohibitively expensive, but so if we can rebalance that generation to meet load.
Helicopters with them, those poles.
Curious if you have any thoughts about what the rest of the country can and should learn from Puerto Rico's experience. What are the lessons that other cities should take away, other counties, other states?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I think in our case, I mean, we got our plan. We got our emergency plan back there. We got the federal agencies before both hurricanes. They were in the island before Irma and before Maria. So they rode the hurricane with us there. But we never expected to have a complete disaster. Complete disaster meaning ports closed, airport closed, no radar, no Doppler.
It's hard to imagine the unimaginable.
Exactly. It was like a situation of war. Even when you're looking at a helicopter, it's like dropping a bomb or a tornado in some areas. That's the kind of disaster you're looking at into it. So I think the red tape and the bureaucracy in some agencies, it's been so difficult to deal with. At the beginning, you know, how the FEMA process was going through the municipalities, they changed it quickly, and they actually provided one coordinator to each municipality. That made a huge difference in terms of the communications between federal agencies. And one thing I think the states could learn about what happened in the island, we actually got a convention center, and you got there all the federal agencies, all the local agencies, and they were working at the same stage, same office. You see desk with all federal agencies just moving across the same issue. Sometimes it will take you weeks, months to get things done. There, you just get a paper and move from one desk to another one. I think that was the best thing in terms of coordination with federal agencies.
Chris, final thoughts on the list?
Unity of effort. Unity of effort was the key driver with the Joint Field Office getting the 1,400 federal emergency responders with the state and local, but also to the paperwork and bureaucracy point. We saw that early on in Harvey and tried to apply lessons learned. It's got to be people over paper. That's the bottom line for an effective response.
Do what makes sense. Sometimes break the rules if necessary, but just do what works.
There will always be the Inspector General, so be mindful.
Okay.
But look, we're there to save lives, and we got to prioritize people over paper.
Okay. Chris, Congresswoman Gonzalez, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.